Recently, in a general conference of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the president of their church, Russell M. Nelson, gave a speech about doubting your doubts, putting faith above all else, effectively demonizing people who question their faith or cast doubts on previous leaders as well as the church itself. So we three are ex-Mormons, and we wanted to go ahead and give our reasons why we left the church. I'm Jared.
I'm Nathaniel.
And I'm Kira.
And this is
Outer
Darkness
Radio. Here are our stories. So, Kira, why did you leave the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints?
That's a very long answer, but to sum it up, one of the main reasons was my education. I started finding questions as I was in my university, like in my biology classes, for example, we'd talk about biological sex, for example, with humans. You know, there's XY chromosomes, XX, XXY, and X naught. There's all sorts of different genital arrangements people can have, secondary sex characteristics people can have, and this kind of contradicted with my previous LDS view of like, there's only two genders, you know, based on two sexes, and that, you know, very narrow, rigid gender identities. And I just got thinking, I'm like, well, if nature doesn't enable a binary itself, why would I attach so much validity to this? And then I started learning about different aspects of oppression and like learning about critical race theory, different feminist theory. I started basically just learning about both a biological, like STEM science, earth science perspective, and also a sociological science perspective. I was having a really hard time reconciling my belief systems with just what is fact. And then I had some experiences previous when I was younger of just kind of questioning some of the teachings specifically related to gender, about like modesty, and just also like, what does it mean that, you know, I'm supposed to be held accountable for, you know, different people's, you know, men's thoughts. You know, another apologist argument that developed was like, well, if you're immodest, you know, you do modesty to show that you love God. And it's like, well, why do you assume someone could not love God because of how they dress? There just was a lot of layers to it. Then I started learning about racism within the church and gender roles, polygamy. It just compiled to a point where it was just so much effort to try and make my worldview work. And I don't mean effort in a way that is like positive, but effort in the way of like, I have to bend reality or deny reality in order, you know, I have to deny existence of certain groups of people. I have to deny experiences. I have to deny all of these things in order for me to view this as true. I thought, you know, if I'm going to be, you know, punished to hell for this little thing, you know, or touching myself or finding a woman attractive, or I don't want to support any God or institution that supports that type of fear-mongering mentality.
Was it difficult for you to leave the Mormon church?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. So it was difficult emotionally, very difficult emotionally, because I had a lot of fears about, oh, I'm a bad person. I'm going to hell. I might be possessed. I honestly had fears that like I was going to be hit by a car in a car accident, hit by a plane, you know, struck by lightning the day I chose not to go to church again. So it was really difficult emotionally and psychologically. Especially because a lot of my peers were not ever members at that time, because this was when I first went to college. And so I was behind a lot of like social and biological like understandings of the world, as well as like different cultural aspects. Like I had a lot of catching up to do, I felt. So that part was kind of hard, but at the same time, it was also easier because I chose to go to a university that wasn't a church university, specifically because I wanted to open my mind. At that time, I wasn't thinking, oh, I'm not going to be a member anymore. But I was like, I want to really take this opportunity to learn, expand my horizons. So then I was able to develop friendships outside of the church, which then made the transition a lot easier because I did have support. But I do still have some difficulties with my relationships with people who are still in the church, specifically because, you know, now that I'm outside of the church, a lot of the arguments when I'm in a discussion about something, you know, it'll be used against me in the sense of like, oh, well, I'm not going to trust what you have to say, or I'm going to discredit your point. I don't have to listen to your points because, you know, you believe in sex outside of marriage and that's super immoral. And so I don't have to believe anything you say. I don't have to listen to you, you know? And so that part was really difficult and still is to this day, dealing with the relationship and, you know, discussions, trying to encourage a more tolerant, open-minded worldview with people who are still coming from that perspective of like, I know everything because I have the truth and I'm in the bubble of the truth. It also helped that Jared is my brother. It also helped, I feel like, and you can confirm or deny this, I feel like you got more of the brunt of it. So it helped having a sibling who was outside of the church who could really become like a friend and a support system within the family unit, because otherwise it would have been really isolating. So, you know,
it's interesting though. I wasn't super vocal about it. You know, I wasn't super vocal about leaving. I just kind of did it. It wasn't actually until you became more vocal about that I was like, oh yeah, I should probably be a little bit more vocal too. For me, I didn't want to be another Mormon ex-Mormon, you know, the people that when you're a Mormon, you would just write off or discredit because they have evil things to say that are not true about the church, you know?
Yeah.
Was it difficult to leave the Mormon church?
Yeah. It was very difficult to leave for me. To my knowledge, I was the first person in our generation of the family, anyway, to leave. I grew up in a very tight-knit church community out in the South who had watched me grow up. You know, I'd been there since I was 11 years old. And when I started having these real doubts and really started being vocal about these doubts, it was in combination with some very eye-opening experiences in my life. Just to be open about it, you know, I was sexually abused around the time that I was supposed to leave on my mission, and because of that abuse, I was not worthy to go on a mission, and it was a very, very trying time, especially because this ward that I'd grown up with really turned their backs on me. You know, it got out what happened. It was a very, it's a very sort of traditional approach that they had to it. Very traditional views that people take. You know, I was taken advantage of by an older woman, and people sort of make a lot of assumptions about that. They think that you're an active and willing participant, that you fully consent to the situation, and thus, you know, I was culpable. I was guilty of sin, and it became common knowledge that that's what had happened to me. And I watched people who had helped raise me really not look me in the eye anymore. It really shook me, you know. And later on, after I moved back from the South, I moved back to Utah to be with my family after that, really to recuperate, to try to recover from what had happened to me. As I sort of explored what had happened, I went to live with some friends from high school, and these were not members, you know. They grew up in Utah, so they were very surrounded by the culture, and they were very gentle with me. They were very sympathetic to what I was feeling, because especially after my experience in the South, I was really shaken. And they sort of started walking me through some of these initial concerns that I was having. Horribly enough, as I started becoming more and more vocal, I lost all of my friends in high school, all of my other friends that weren't part of this specific group that I was living with. All this enormous support system that I had just sort of collapsed around me. Family members started taking a very different tack with me, sort of ramped up a very abusive relationship that I had with my father. It was very, very difficult, I would say. It felt very isolating. So yeah, I mean, it was difficult. Yes, it was very difficult.
Yeah.
It was all part of it. Yeah, it was all a process. That was my wake up call. It was a moment that really kind of shifted the ground and kind of turned it around to let me see things just weren't the way that I had been told they would be my entire life. And I think in addition to this sort of traumatic event that went on for years, in addition to that, I had this cognitive dissonance, like Kira said in her story, just the pressure of expectation versus reality that was building. The things that weren't quite lining up, that I had been pushing down and pushing down and pushing down for years, built and built and built and built until it was like a physical pressure in my head all the time. It was miserable. And I just eventually couldn't take it anymore. I was just like, listen, I don't believe this anymore. And here are the reasons why. I had this very traumatic experience, but I also had very loving experience with my friends, who kind of showed me that there are people out there who live true to themselves. They live the best lives that they can, and they are exposed to the material that I was exposed to, and they just simply didn't believe it. It's not that they were sinners or they weren't denying some deep gut instinct to believe. They just didn't believe it. They found it, in fact, ludicrous, some of the things that I had been raised to believe. Eventually, some of the things, most especially, I think, the biggest conflict for me, aside from just no longer being able to acknowledge, like, hey, I think that my friends and these people that I've come to think of as family are just not going to make it to be with God in the afterlife. I started investigating a lot more. I started really engaging with material that was available to everybody online. And the biggest stumbling block for me was learning the truth about race in the church. Learning that the priesthood was withheld from black men for the majority of the church's history up until very recently.
Was that only black men, or was it people of color in general? Do we know?
People of color in general. Yeah, it wasn't anybody but white and delightsome, quote, people.
Yeah.
Local. It was even to the point of, they would have to fly people in from Utah to be church leadership in these wards out in foreign countries. They couldn't have local leaders. Learning that was very shocking to me, because you're raised, and this is, this goes into a whole conversation about privilege and entitlement, but you're raised being told that you can have a personal relationship with God. And then I was shocked to learn that that's not always what the church taught. Some men couldn't, and women can't have the same kind of personal relationship with God that white straight men could.
Yeah. An unfortunate thing about the early church is they did teach that people who were disobedient or bad in the pre-earth life, that they became people of color because of disobedience, because of something bad they did before they were born. Right. And then the Book of Mormon reinforces those points and those doctrines. And the Book of Mormon itself, they've changed it in different editions to make it sound less offensive. I mean, where the people who were like not following God were cursed with black skin, and those who were following God were white and delightsome, or pure and delightsome is what they then changed it to, but that they had white skin,
Right.
So basically for me, I went on a mission. I served a mission here in the Philippines, in the provinces of Bataan, Pangasinan, and Zambales. And I noticed a few things about superstitions that I saw how people had brought their sort of superstitions and adapted it to LDS beliefs. People would jump to supernatural explanations before conceiving of like rational ideas. Like, oh, a light was left on all night, it must have been a ghost. But really, no, I just left the light on by accident. So there are things like that. And then when I came back to the US after that, I realized that's how the other church members are, even in the US. So it wasn't like there are a lot of superstitions and a lot of things that I called fluff for the longest time, because it just felt like it was out of touch with what reality was, what I was experiencing as reality, and what I was learning fit more with what I believed was real. I got engaged to be married pretty much because this person was Filipino, where I served my mission, and because I was like, hey, we both speak Tagalog. 2, we're super spiritual. We both are very firm believers in the gospel, in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. All of our conversations were dedicated to that. And I had these cognitive dissonances about us being a thing, because I didn't feel like we were actually right for each other in the end. But what a lot of people told me is that any righteous young man and young woman can be married to one another. That's something that was taught, not as much about compatibility, but more about mutual faithfulness to the church and to God, and then that would result ultimately in it being a good marriage. We just had different interests, I guess, ultimately. So I'd ask around to older people that I trusted who are members of the church and ask them if something like sex be enough to compensate for doubts about whether a marriage will work or not. And 90+% said yes, that would compensate. Anyway, I didn't continue the engagement. I broke it off after having some very intense dreams, very intense cognitive dissonance about it. After that, I realized, just feeling really isolated and confused and at odds with what my belief system said and what reality was. And then I took an epistemology course, like how do we know what we know, at BYU, the Mormon school, And there we discussed how could we prove what we actually know. And I realized that I don't actually know the church is true. I don't actually know the Book of Mormon is true. And so that was problematic, that the circular logic of it, if you pray and keep praying, then you'll know it's true. Well, what if it's not true, but you just keep praying and praying? And another big thing was also Prop 8 about gay marriage. Being a straight person, I was like, I didn't really have conflicts about my own personal identity, but what I had a conflict with was the church really made it a point that this is wrong. And I thought, well, if this isn't even true in the first place, why are we putting people through such mental anguish that they can't be their genuine selves? Not to mention that growing up throughout my life, I was taught that touching myself was evil, and it led to a lot of self-hate, and it led to a lot of lowered confidence and depression and isolation from other people, just because of the things that were taught to me and most members of the church. And it seems convenient enough for the leaders to wash their hands of it and say, well, the Lord God loves you too, without actually being accepting of what you're doing. Because you can't be acceptable ultimately in the end. You can't go to the temple if you're engaged in any of these activities. You're not worthy. So I realized, well, most likely it's a socially constructed thing. We just reinforce one another's values and beliefs. And because we were born in it, we never question it. So I was questioning it a lot. It just felt like it wasn't in touch with my reality. And it was super difficult because I was already isolated, but I felt like I'd be harshly judged, kind of like what Nate was saying. And I felt like I was going to be ostracized. And then I realized, I think one of the things that was very liberating to me is like, well, they're not even super involved in my life, but they might be involved in my life once I leave the church just to save me. And I realized how disingenuous that motivation of taking care of a person is. And why can't it just be about putting humans and all that first instead of like belief systems? Why do we have to prioritize these belief systems that could be false and are very prejudiced and hateful towards certain lifestyles and thereby the people who live those lifestyles? I believe that meaning can be derived our interactions with one another. Like there doesn't have to be a huge cosmological meaning to our lives at all. We can just take a joy in like hearing a song or bonding over an idea or creating something together. We can have meaning and beauty without a God. It took 3 years, I think, for me to leave the church. It wasn't, so it wasn't easy. But in the end, I realized I didn't need it. What is something you'd like LDS members or believers in general to know about your leaving the church?
First and foremost it wasn't any sort of prodigal son story, apostate story that like specifically in the LDS church, we're told that people who leave the church just take this nosedive, right? They go and they immediately drink like 7 shots of whiskey while they're shooting themselves up with heroin and wind up in a back alley somewhere. Like it's just it's a narrative that especially
that's meant to keep you in.
Not so much anymore, but especially in the early 2000s was very, very prevalent. And mine just wasn't that. Like I didn't even drink until, I don't know, 4 years after I'd left the church. Everything was a process. But first in that process came the intellectual side of it. Like we said, what kind of instigated this video was Russell, good old Rusty, saying that that lazy learners or disengaged, lax disciples are the people that fall away. I was a very engaged disciple. I was a very engaged learner from a young age. Just devoured any material I could get my hands on, and I prayed fervently. I wasn't looking for an excuse to leave. Even after these horrible things happened to me, I was looking for every reason I could find to stay in the church. And unfortunately, I just found more and more reasons to go instead. And I think that's what I would hope anyone who's considering the other side of things is that the advice that you just completely disregard anyone who's left or anyone who's doubting is selfish advice, is meant to ultimately keep your mind closed and limited.
So I think I'm kind of gonna piggyback off of what Nate was saying, and I think curiosity is so demonized in the church, and I think it's so important to explore your curiosity without restraint, because I feel like so much, I've heard, you're encouraged to question, but I'd always find this point when I would question in seminary, in young women's, where there was just no tolerance for my questioning anymore. It'd be, well, that's up to God. Well, you just got to trust. Well, you just got to have faith. And it was like you could tell there was no critical, there was no rigor around these ideas, because it basically, the answer was, oh, well, you don't know, God knows, don't ask that question again, kind of thing. One thing I've come to realize is with curiosity. You know how you hear about the slippery slope of sin of like, oh, you know, once you do this one thing, you'll, you know, once you take one shot of whiskey, you'll suddenly be murdering entire families. One, that's not true. It doesn't happen like that. And I want LDS members to know that it doesn't happen like that. There's a learning curve. There's, you know, you smoke weed once, you're not going to become an addict. Okay, you know, some people may, but it's not quite as chaotic as you think it is, and it's not quite as scary as you think it is. And I also noticed that, you know, some of the things that were labeled as sin, like it's like, oh, you're falling down the slippery slope of sin. It's like, well, when you've been taught something your whole life is wrong, and then you find out it might not actually be wrong, of course you're going to question what else might be wrong. Of course you're going to go and evaluate all of your other ideas and be like, is this right? You know, what are my thoughts and ethics on this? Like, so you can see people exploring their curiosity and look at it and be like, oh, it looks like the slippery slope of sin. No, it's not. It might look like that curve of people, you know, questioning things, trying things, you know, then coming to answers, conclusions. It's not like you're going to be possessed.
Yeah.
For questioning, for exploring that.
For myself, I would like LDS and even believers, just religionists in general, or people of faith in general, I would like them to know that, yeah, I also was super, super devout in my belief. And I realized that I simply realized that it might not be true. And I had a lot of valid reasons for why. And I could pinpoint all of those, and I'm sure throughout the course of this channel we will. But one of the biggest things was it is okay to be curious. Ideas aren't harmful. There is a life outside of faith, and we cannot prove or disprove, you know, just to make a happy point for those who would say you can't disprove either. Yeah, we can't disprove there being a creator, but what we can actually prove is the existence of each other. So why are we not prioritizing that? That's my philosophy, is social priority. Why don't we prioritize what is for certain and what does exist for certain? Why don't we prioritize treating that well? If God does exist, if your version of God is the right God, then isn't that God the creator of all things, and we're the creations too, and you ought to treat them with respect and reverence because we're their creations? And as for those who aren't, you know, we as a human species need comfort. We need a place of belonging. And in fact, that's one of the theories that I have, and a lot of social scientists have, as to why religion exists in the first place. Is it's a social construct. It provides community, it fulfills a need, and it gives a sense of meaning. You know, but that doesn't automatically objectively make it true, and it's worth exploring all sorts of ideas, and there's nothing dangerous about that. And to also reference what Nate and Kira both said, I didn't have my first drink of alcohol until I was 27 years old, and it made me sick to my stomach, even after being out of the church. This speaks to a certain level of impressionability that was on my mind. We could maybe call it brainwashing even, that I had a programming that made me very, very averse to alcohol. It wasn't as bad if it was like a friend, but if it was a girlfriend or myself, it made me super, super, super uncomfortable. That if they would drink I was just not going to go anywhere near it. So that took 3 years, even after I was agnostic, even after I was like, I don't think this is true. So this says something about the programming that happens. Anyhow, it's not dangerous to research. It's not dangerous to think. It's not dangerous to have discussions like this. you're welcome to this discussion. You can comment. So yeah, that's all I've got to say on that.
Please don't discount us because we're a bunch of doubters discussing our doubts.
Yeah, exactly. Please don't discount us, especially because a lot of times, or most of the time, we're pretty much basing what we think about life, and it's ever expanding, it's ever growing, based on what is scientifically proven, or based on like different theories that have been thought over and mulled over for centuries, so there's a lot of thought that goes into it.
And one last thing I guess I wanted to say is that one thing that really struck me and continues to strike me is that there's a narrative inside not just the Mormon church, but I think Christianity in general, that the world outside belief is very dark and very cold and very like there's nothing constant, that everything is subject to popular opinion and that there's nothing of real value or intrinsic goodness, or that the laws of men are inherently corrupt and yada yada yada. I had a very small box that I lived in for 19 years of my life, and the world was very simple and very plain. I had a lot of questions, like Kira said. I constantly asked questions, but that's what it was. It was a very small box. Once I stepped outside of that box, honestly, legitimately, I found more beauty and more meaning and more reasons to be happy and to celebrate the world and humanity and the universe than I ever had inside that box.
Mm-hmm. And how wonderful it is, too, that we can find meaning for ourselves. Like maybe there is no grand overall meaning, but isn't it more meaningful if we ourselves find the meaning in a thing instead of that meaning being forced onto us? This is your meaning, even if it goes against who you are.
I had this favorite show called Angel, and one of my favorite quotes from the show Angel is, "If nothing we do matters, what matters is what we do."
Again, like Nate said, and I did mention this, but I went on my mission. Like I had friends that came home early from their missions before I went on my mission who left the church, and I was devastated. Anyway, the point being is I knew it like really, really super well. And I dare say all of us knew it very well, the doctrines, everything. We would argue against people. We would defend it, So it's not like we're some evil big bad wolves, We're not luring you to go away from your faith. We're just saying if you have questions and you're questioning it, question it. Keep it going. It's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. If it's true, it'll be true tomorrow too. It'll stand up against refutation.
To take your worldview and say like, this is the one worldview, is to take your experience and project it onto how many ever billion people. Like maybe, I don't think there's any harm in taking the perspective of, let's look from let's try to explore and learn about a perspective that isn't mine and see if I still have that perspective after.
Anyhow, thank you very much for watching. It's been a long journey for us, and we're happy to finally just let it out here on the internet. I hope that this comforts some people, and I hope that those who are upset by this, that maybe you could just take a little time to listen more to what we went through. Anything else?
We love you.
We heart you. It says it right here on our banner. Welcome to Outer Darkness Radio. Please be sure to kindly affirm that like button. We heart you. It's true. Finger tap, finger touch.